So as we just heard, what's a really important part of my work is this idea that memory is not a unitary phenomenon, but there are distinct memory systems that differ in terms of their behavioral characteristics as well as their neural substrates. So the big distinction is between declarative and non-declarative memory. Non-declarative memory is another word for implicit memory. In terms of their characteristics, declarative memory is really what we typically think of when we think of memory. It's memory for facts and events, information you're consciously aware of, like what you had for breakfast this morning or the name of a colleague that you met yesterday, things that you're aware that you're remembering. It's declarative in the sense that you could tell me, you could declare that you have this knowledge. Now, in contrast, non-declarative memory refers to information that you're not necessarily aware that you've learned, and information that, as we heard, is real automatic and is really, you only access it through your performance. You can't actually declare that you have this information. And a good example of this is motor skill learning. So if you practice your tennis stroke, you'll get better from day to day. But if I ask you, what are you doing differently now that you weren't doing before, it'll be very difficult for you to tell me what that is. Now, importantly, these differ in their behavioral properties. So the idea of one, there is awareness, the other, there isn't necessarily awareness. Also, they differ in terms of their flexibility. Declarative memories are very flexible. I can ask you what you had for breakfast this morning, and you could answer me in a different language. You could type it, you could verbally say it. I could ask the question in a slightly different way. You could give the same answer. Whereas non-declarative memory tends to be less flexible, that it can really only be accessed in a particular context with particular stimuli. So for instance, a tennis stroke, if you could learn with one particular racket, then you change your racket, you might not show absolute 100% transfer. There might be some kind of a learning process to learn with that new racket. And importantly, these two types of memory differ in their neural substrates. Declarative memory depends on structures in the medial temporal lobe, including the hippocampus, whereas non-declarative memory does not. So these two types of memory are really supported by very different neural structures. Just, again, the idea that they're quite different types of memory. So I'm today going to talk about habit learning, which of course is very relevant to studying addiction and the development of addiction. Habit learning is a form of non-declarative memory, which is characterized by the implicit learning of stimulus-response associations. Now, and a key feature of stimulus-response learning is insensitivity to devaluation of the reinforcer. So the subject learns that a certain stimulus will start to elicit a response in this very automatic, implicit way. And even at the point, and the reinforcer just plugs those two together. And even if later, after learning has occurred, if the reinforcer is no longer attractive, or the subject doesn't want the reinforcer, that habit will remain. And on the next slide, let me just kind of walk you through what I mean by that. So let's examine a situation in the laboratory where we have a laboratory rat that when there's a tone, if he presses a bar, he gets food, so he gets reinforcement. So with time, the reinforcer of food will stamp in that tone bar press association, that stimulus response association. So after enough trials, the rat will very automatically just press a bar when he hears a tone. Now, the key feature of habit learning is then later if you make the food no longer attractive to him or take away the food or he's not hungry anymore, he will nevertheless, when he hears the tone, just out of force of habit, press the bar. So that's really what we mean by habit learning, this idea that the reinforcer is not represented in the association, and that when it's devalued, you still have the learning. That's a key feature of habit learning. Now, as I said, these habit learning and declarative learning depend on different neural systems. So damage to the hippocampus, which is this red structure here, leaves habit learning intact, and that's been shown in humans as well as in experimental animals. Whereas damage to the neostriatum, here part of the basal ganglia, impairs habit learning but not declarative learning. So there's a double dissociation between these two types of learning as they depend on these two different brain systems. Now, what I wanted to do is just describe one experiment that kind of gives a flavor of the sorts of experiments I'm doing in my laboratory to actually look at the neural substrates of habit learning. And in this particular experiment I'm going to describe, we trained animals to under an instrumental conditioning using an interval schedule. And the idea was to train them up so they learned a stimulus response habit, and then we would look at the neural substrates that are important for supporting that habit. So when we use an interval schedule, that tends to make animals learn things in a habit-like way. An interval schedule is that subjects receive a reinforcer after an interval if a response was made during that interval, and reinforcement's not based on the number of responses. And so that's sort of like getting your mail. You know, the mail comes once a day. If you make a response, go down and get your mail at any time during that interval, you'll be reinforced. It doesn't matter. If you go down and try to get your mail 90 times a day, you're not going to get any more mail than if you go once a day. So you're reinforced on an interval schedule with mail. So that's when we train animals under that kind of a reinforcement schedule, they'll tend to develop habits, meaning when we make the reinforcer no longer attractive, they'll continue to respond at the same rate as if they wanted the reinforcer. So this type of conditioning, through a lot of studies of animal learning, appears to be mediated by SR associations. Okay, so I was interested in what are the neural substrates of this particular kind of learning. And the logic of this experiment is to train rats that have lesions of particular regions in the neostriatum, either the dorsolateral part or the dorsomedial part, and then train them in this task using an interval schedule. Train them in a task that normally would be learned as a habit. And then after I had trained them up, probe the content of what association to see which ones had learned as a habit and which groups perhaps had learned it in a more goal-directed way, that, oh, this particular response leads to this outcome, not in this habit-like way. So I think the axis cut off here, but this is basically the inner reinforcement interval. So at the beginning, they're not getting all the food pellets, but towards the end, they're pressing at least once in every interval, so they're getting their reinforcement. So all the rats are learning this. The ones that have no lesion and the ones that have lesions in these two different parts of the neostriatum are learning. But the question is, are they learning the same thing? And let's just focus on the top. This is just their performance on the last day. This is sort of what I showed you in the previous graph, that all the rats are pressing at about the same rate. But then the question is, now let's make it so they don't want the food anymore. We can pair the particular food that they were pressing, that they were reinforced with something that makes them ill, so now they no longer want to eat the food. Now what happens when we put them back in the box? See, are they going to actually respond? Well, the normal rats do. This shows they've learned a habit. Here, the ones that devalue, the ones that hate the food, are responding just as much as the ones that want the food. In this case, this is the definition of habit. They are responding in this automatic, habitual, compulsive way. They're just pressing that bar even though they don't want the food. Now, in contrast, the rats that had a lesion in this part of the dorsolateral striatum, when they don't want the food, they stop pressing, compared to the ones that, of course, want the food. There's a significant difference here. And the ones that have the lesion in a slightly different place, it's sort of an in-between case. So this is interesting in that this brain lesion in some ways has made the rats more insightful, in that they have modified their behavior based on, because they didn't learn it as a habit. They learned it as a goal direction action. When I press this bar, I get this food, rather than just a stimulus response habit like the control rats. So now let me just summarize. I've tried to convince you that implicit habit learning is a distinct type of learning from just our declarative learning, and that the dorsolateral neostriatum seems to be a key part of this system. And I think an important thing to remember about habits, or actually fundamental to what we think of as a habit, is that habits aren't sensitive to manipulating consequences. That and I think this probably has implications for treatment, in that just making the consequences bad, or even if a particular drug is not reinforcing anymore, that the stimulus response behaviors may persist. And finally, I think that this work could be important because insights into the neural substrates of habit that we are gaining from work with experimental animals could lead to neuroimaging hypotheses in humans that might lead to insights about treatment outcomes that might be even more sensitive than behavioral measures. Thank you.